Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you. I hope everybody's healthy and well. And I'm very happy that you're here. I know this is going to be a wonderful evening and a thought-provoking, important conversation. I've put already in the chat bar Rabbi Laura Geller's website, so you can find her website, learn more about her, or access her materials. I'm going to put in, if I haven't, actually I think I did already, the name of her book, which is the source for this talk this evening. So this is our Rabbis in Residence series that we started this year. Last year it was a series on health and wellness. This year it's on wisdom and better ways to live our lives. And we've had fantastic speakers already. And Rabbi Geller will be one of them as well, I'm sure, and joins a great group of colleagues. At the end of the presentation this evening, Wendy Levinson, to whom I am grateful for creating this series, having the initiative, and then putting the hard work in to bring it to fruition. Wendy will talk about who's next speakers, and you can learn more about the programs. All right, without further ado, we're recording so that if you know that somebody's missing tonight, but you think they would appreciate it or learn from it, and I think that might be the case for many people, you can share it with them. So I'm now going to spotlight you, Wendy, so you can make our introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Of course.
Rabbi Laura Geller is the Rabbi Emerita of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills, and she was twice named one of Newsweek's 50 most influential rabbis in America. She was named by PBS Next Avenue as one of the 50 2017 influencers in aging. Prior to becoming one of the first women to be selected through a national search to lead a major metropolitan synagogue, Rabbi Geller served as the director of Hillel of University of Southern California for 14 years and as the Pacific Southwest region's executive director of the American Jewish Congress for 4 years. She was featured in the PBS documentary Jewish Americans. Author of numerous articles and books in journals, she was on the editorial board of The Torah, a Women's Commentary. She serves as a fellow of the Corporation of Brown University, from where she graduated in 1971. In addition, she serves on the boards of Encore.org and the Jewish Women's Archives. Ordained by Hebrew Union College in 1976, she is the third woman in the Reform movement to become a rabbi. Rabbi Geller's book, Getting Good at Getting Older, was named a National Jewish Book Award finalist in the category of Contemporary Jewish Life and Practice. It is a tour through the resources and skills needed to navigate the years between maturity and old age, and it gives us an opportunity to discover in Jewish tradition and culture the tools to bring meaning and purpose to this new stage of life. Her book is in the chat. It also can be found on Amazon or on her website. Getting Good at Getting Older finds the humor in the predicaments we can create as we either try to address the issues or seek to avoid them. The book sets a light tone for the serious work of reimagining our approach to aging. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you Rabbi Laura Geller.
Wendy, thank you very much. What you didn't tell everybody is that we have known each other since I was your rabbi when you were at USC a few years ago, right? So it's nice to see you again, and I'm really grateful that you reached out and invited me to your community. And I'm delighted that Rabbi Li-Paz, to connect with him again and to visit not only your congregation, but visit in each of your homes. So I want to begin by starting with a text that is familiar to some of you. It's from Pirkei Avot, usually translated as the sayings of the fathers or the sayings of the ancestors, maybe better translated as essential teachings. It's a little tractate of the Mishnah from, let's say, around the 2nd century of the Common Era. And it imagines what a life cycle looks like. Here's what it says. Remember, 200 of the Common Era. At 5 years, the study of Torah. At 10, the study of Mishnah. At 13, subject to the commandments. This, by the way, is where we get bar mitzvah at 13. At 15, the study of Talmud. At 18, the bridal canopy. At 20, the pursuit of livelihood. At 30, the peak of strength. At 40, for understanding. At 50, able to give counsel. At 60, one who has acquired wisdom. At 70, the fullness of life. At 80, the age of strength. At 90, a bent body. At 100, as good as dead and gone completely out of the world. So the first thing I want to say is, when you wish somebody on their birthday, Ad Mea Ve'esrim, you should live to be 120, because that's how long Moses lived. Apparently, by whoever wrote this little piece of Mishnah didn't believe that, right? At 100, as good as dead and gone completely out of the world. So Ad Mea Ve'esrim, 120, I'm not sure that's such a blessing. I have heard recently that people have reframed that. So when you want to wish somebody happy birthday, you say Ad Mea Ka'esrim. You should live to be 100 as though you were 20, with that same energy, with that same vitality, with that same curiosity. So if we had time, we could really take a closer look at this description of the stages of a life. But I want to point out to you that there seem to be 4 of them. The first, study of scripture, Mishnah, subject to the commandments, Talmud, it's all about learning. And then at 18, a little earlier than we do it now, building a family and a career. And then at 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80, it has something to do with wisdom. And then at 90, something to do with letting go and getting ready. I want you to think for a moment about how you would describe the stages of your life. How would your description be different? So just think about that for a moment. What's interesting to me, and I think to all of us, is that the stages of a life are not biological stages. They're socially constructed. We are living, those of us who are between midlife and frail old age, very different lives than our grandparents did. In fact, we're living 30 years longer. And those 30 years are not tagged on to the end of our life, but they're in the middle, between midlife and frail old age. It's a new stage of life. Think for a moment, adolescence. You think of that as biologically given, but in fact, the first time the word adolescence appeared in psychological literature in the United States was in the 1920s. Why? Because until then, there wasn't such a thing as adolescence. People went from being children to being adults, right? And now we are realizing, at least before the pandemic, that there's a new stage of life that people are calling emergent adulthood. That's when our millennial kids, if we have them, come home and live with us because they haven't launched yet. Very different from those of us in my age cohort who wouldn't really have thought about moving home after college or as we were getting ready to begin our adult lives. So again, socially constructed. So here we are in this new stage of life. And one of the problems with this stage of life is that we don't know what to call it. One of the things we learned years ago through the women's movement is that you can't name something. You can't kind of get your hands around it. So I want to ask you to think about this for a minute and maybe put it in the chat. What do you call yourself at this stage? What do you call yourself? And what would you want to call your cohort? Very often we're called boomers, but boomers is a technical generation, people born between 1946 and 1964. So some of us are technically boomers, but some of us are not. So what do you call yourself? How many of you like to be called seniors? Raise your hand. I can't see the screen, so Wendy or Rabbi Li-Paz, are people raising their hands? People like the word senior?
No. There's
Uh,
no great votes here for seniors.
is
For
there
the word senior, nothing apparent.
is
And
there
again,
any,
just so you know, I'm not seeing them, so I'm not seeing their hands raised. There's one hand raised, actually. It
okay.
does tell me, actually, that
Can,
one person raised their hand.
can you call on that one person to hear why that person likes the word senior?
I can't ask her verbally, but I can ask Jan. I can ask you, if you don't mind, to write it in the Q&A or to write it in the chat, if you're willing. Somebody else is saying they prefer maturing. Someone else says middle-aged.
Okay, good. Those are good words. Other words? The thing about senior that's difficult is, senior, I don't know, but I did like those senior discounts when the olden days when we could still go to the movies, right?
A
But
couple more are emerging. One just says older. Another one says Altakaker. Another
okay,
one says interested and interesting.
okay,
Another one, as I said, middle-aged, mature. Another one says vibrant lady.
okay, nice.
And the woman who raised her hand, Jan, said, it's because it's what I feel I am.
Okay.
Someone else says young at heart. Another says mom, Grammy, and friend, or by name. And another, okay, sorry. Somebody else's comment. Somebody else says, oh, maybe you wrote, but someone said accomplished, which I like very much as well.
So one of the challenges, let's say for a synagogue, is you want to bring together this cohort. How you name it is going to in some way influence who comes and who doesn't. The senior citizens, if you like it, you'll come, and if you don't like that, you won't come. Some synagogues use the word elders. What's interesting about that is people don't like the word because it sounds too close to elderly, and yet our religious tradition, as other religious traditions, actually honor elders. So in some ways, one ought to aspire to become an elder, and yet we're not comfortable with the word. So what are some other words? Retired only works if you actually worked for money. Rewired, seasoned, younger, older, third chapter, encore generation, or my favorite, Dr. Laura Carstensen from the Stanford Center on Longevity calls this stage and us perennials. Why perennials? We're still blooming, some years not so good, some years better, but we're still alive, growing, and blooming. The important thing to recognize as we even begin this conversation is that we're not just talking about ourselves. We are actually creating a new life stage. Someday our millennial children or grandchildren will be in this stage. And how we do this, how we reframe this new stage of life, is going to have a big impact on the generations that follow us. I also want to say that this is not a chronological age, but again, it's a life stage. We have a lot in common, but there are ways in which we're very different from each other. Some of us are healthy and still very active, while others wrestle with physical challenges, with disabilities, with illness, with caregiving. Some of us are parents of adult children or grandparents, but some of us don't have kids or grandchildren, or don't have the kinds of connections with them that we wish we had. Some of us are solo agers. Some of us have partners. Some of us are straight. Some are LGBTQ. Some of us have discretionary resources, and some of us worry about financial futures. It's very important to notice that while we have much in common, we're still a diverse group, and we need to see ourselves as the individuals that we are. The point is that we are reimagining a life stage, And actually, we're reimagining a lifespan as well. Demographers predict that children who were born since 2000 will live to be 100. And children born in 2007 will live to be 104. So it's not like as good as dead and gone from the world anymore. The problem is most of our policies were put in place for very different assumptions about the age of our populations. Think about Social Security at 65. Why? It's because when it was instituted, people only lived a few years longer than 65. But now it is so different. Remember that in the 1900s, life expectancy reached 47. It reached 77 at the end of the century. Today, it's around 79, and it continues to increase. Dr. Carstensen says, it's time to get serious about a major redesign of life. In her view, the tension surrounding aging is due largely to the speed with which life expectancy is increasing. Long lives are not the problem. The problem is that we're living in a culture that was designed for lives half as long as the ones we have. Think about it. Now retirements can span 4 decades. Now education ends in the early 20s, but why should it? I actually have the time and the inclination to go back to school. Maybe I would take it more seriously than I did when I was 18 and in college. Social norms that dictate intergenerational responsibilities are also changing. So a question that we need to be thinking of as a Jewish community and as a general society is how do the traditional models of education, work, lifestyles, social relationships, financial planning, healthcare, early childhood, and intergenerational compacts need to change to support long lives. I don't know if you saw it, but 2 weeks ago in the New York Times, in Sunday's business section, there was an article that was titled, What You Will Need If You Live to Be 100. And the focus in the article was on a young couple in their 30s who had gone to a retirement planner. And the article was about the need to reimagine retirement planning to longevity planning, which combines conventional financial techniques with life planning. And the article says, in developing a core life planning philosophy, you have to ponder answers to 3 questions. What do you want out of life? What gives you joy? And how do you pay for it? Those are challenging questions in our world and also in our Jewish community. And we're the pioneers. All of us are pioneers at getting good, at getting older. So I want to tell you about this book. Almost 50 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, there was a revolution taking place in the Jewish world. I wasn't active in creating the revolution, but it was part of the reason I ended up going to rabbinical school in 1971. That revolution was energized by the beginning of the Jewish counterculture, and it was captured a few years later by a book that was modeled after the Whole Earth Catalog, and it was called The Jewish Catalog, a do-it-yourself kit. This is what it looked like. Can you all see? Just if you remember the book, put in the chat that you remember the book. It turns out it was a pretty important book because it captured that generation of baby boomers to take responsibility for their own Jewish lives. And it offered the tools to help people do that. Some of you might even have used the challah recipe in it the first time you ever tried to bake challah. Well, the co-author of that book was my late husband, Richard Siegel. I didn't know him then. We got married years later. But the book that Rich and I wrote together is very much influenced by the Jewish catalog, because that was the 60s and 70s. And now that some of us are in our 60s and 70s, Rich felt we needed another do-it-yourself kit to help us navigate the changes that are part of our lives as we grow older. So that is the first origin story of this book, getting good at getting older. And you see that it is very similar in the way it looks, in the color, in the design on the inside to the Jewish catalog. It's meant to remind you of the Jewish catalog because, like the Jewish catalog, getting good at getting older is a toolkit. And like the Jewish catalog, it has a sense of humor. The book includes irreverent cartoons and some photographs, including my favorite, the backside of Maxine Menster's tombstone in Iowa, which is a recipe for cookies. Apparently, every time someone asked for her cookie recipe, she would say, "Over my dead body." So let me tell you the second reason Rich and I wrote the book. I was 62, and we were beginning to think about retirement. And I noticed that a huge percentage of the congregants at my synagogue, Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills, were boomers, and many of them were leaving the congregation because they didn't feel like we were doing anything for them. That observation led to a listening campaign where we talked to about 250 congregants in people's homes in small group conversations that were facilitated by congregants. And we asked people how they feel about this stage of life, this stage between maturity and frail old age, between building families and careers and frail old age. This stage that, as I said, didn't exist for our grandparents. We asked, what do you want in those extra years? Now that more years have been added to your life, how are you going to add more life to those years? We asked, what keeps you up at night? What gets you up in the morning? What are your fears and what are your hopes? People shared their fears, and these were very powerful and moving conversations. The first fear was becoming invisible. Who am I when I'm no longer the senior rabbi of Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills? People were fearful of becoming isolated and lonely because our social capital shrinks at this stage of our life. People we drove carpool with, they're not in our life anymore. Some friends are moving away or dying. Who are my friends? How am I going to deal with loneliness? The third fear, being without purpose. Well, what am I going to do all day? And the fourth fear, becoming dependent. God forbid I should ever be dependent, especially on my children. And then people shared questions in these conversations. Questions like, how do I navigate changing relationships with my older parents, with millennial children, with intimate partners, and in particular, with friends? How do I nurture long-term friendships? How do I let go of toxic friendships? Now that I know that there's less time ahead than there was behind, do I still want to have people in my life who are sucking energy from me as opposed to giving me nurture? And how do I make new friends at this stage of my life? As friends move away, kids too, for some of us, the question kept coming up, with whom do I want to grow old? And in what kinds of settings? Do I want to move to a retirement community? Do I want to move to be near my kids? Do I want to age in place, stay in the home that I love? But if I do that, what kinds of changes do I need to make in my neighborhood or in my synagogue in order to enable me to stay in my home in a way that nurtures and enables me to continue to grow? Other questions. How do I deal with illness, my own or that of my friends? There's no question that people die all through our lives. People are ill all through our lives, but it happens more as we get older. I don't know about you, but I have a rule with my friends, and that is we can only do the organ recital for 5 minutes. What's the organ recital? It's when everybody goes around and talks about what's wrong with each of their organs. Okay, we can do that for a little bit at the beginning of a conversation, but it can't be a whole evening. How do I deal with illness? My own or that of my friends? And then other questions. What do I need to do to get ready for the inevitable? Those end of life conversations that I know I need to have. How do I have them with my adult kids if they don't want to have them, or if I don't want to have them? And what if I don't have kids? With whom do I have them? What was really amazing to me about Temple Emmanuel is that the majority of congregants had end-of-life directives, but a very small percentage of them had actually shared them with their adult children. And I'm sure your rabbi can tell you what I'm about to say. The best gift that you can give to people who come after you is to be clear about what you want. Because when you can no longer articulate what you want, the last thing that is good for the people you love is that they fight about it because they don't know what you wanted. Other questions. What will give meaning to my life now that I can no longer work full-time? How can I find a volunteer or a paid position to which I can bring my expertise, my talent, my passion? I don't want to stuff envelopes at this stage of my life. I want to find a way to use my energy, my passion, what I really care about, my talent, in an organization that knows how to use someone like me. How do I find that? And then there were a lot of questions about legacy. If I have one bad piece of news to give you in this talk, here it comes. Our kids don't want our stuff. What are we going to do with all that stuff? It's part of legacy, how we think about giving away, how we give away money, how we give away things, how we give away our stories, and how we give away our values. And finally, and this question really energized me, what do I have to do now I'm 70, to become the 85-year-old I someday hope to be? We all remember that wonderful scene in When Harry Met Sally, when Estelle Reiner says, I want what she's having. Well, many of us know people who are older than we, people who we would like to be like when we get to be their age. What work do we need to do on ourselves now in order to become that vision of a much older adult? And how can Jewish wisdom and spiritual practice help me do that? All the data teaches us that the character traits that are connected to healthy, engaged, joyful aging are gratitude, forgiveness, patience, equanimity, just to name a few. Our tradition actually has ways to work on those character traits. Now is the time to start. How can we start? And a question that emerged from me that I'll talk about in a few minutes, how do I mark the moments in this stage of my life that are important? So all that came up in the listening campaign, and that became the table of contents for the book, Getting Good at Getting Older. There are 6 sections in the book. The first is getting good at gaining wisdom. The second is getting good at getting along. The third is getting good at getting better. The fourth, getting good at getting ready. The fifth, getting good at giving back. And the sixth, getting good at giving away. Each section offers actual tools and resources that will help you find your own answers to these questions. This is not a sermon. It's not a book that tells you to treasure every moment, number our days so that we may acquire a heart of wisdom, although that's part of getting good at getting older. This is actually a toolkit. You pick it up when you're working on a specific issue. You want to have that conversation with your kids and you don't know how to do it. The book actually gives you the questions that you might want to ask and raises questions about the setting. So Rich and I wrote the majority of the book, but there was a lot that we didn't know. And so we went to friends or other experts to write some of the sections themselves. So for example, the section on having those conversations that nobody wants to have were actually written by the people that created the Conversation Project, which is a national movement, not Jewish, that is encouraging people around the country to have these end-of-life conversations. The section on visiting the sick was written by a teacher, Rabbi Bill Cutter, who has done a lot of work around chaplaincy and visiting the sick. So you pick up the book when you're dealing with one of these issues. And it turns out that people find it to be extremely helpful. So that's why we wrote the book. The truth is that the book was published more than a year ago, a lifetime ago, before the plague, before people in our age cohort were afraid that we wouldn't have the opportunity to get good at getting older. If I were writing the book now, I'd pay attention to some of the issues that have emerged for all of us because of the pandemic. They were always there, but they've really come to light because of the pandemic. The first is the issue, there are 4 of them: ageism, intergenerational tensions and opportunities, loneliness and isolation, including the specific and additional challenges for those people who are solo agers. And unfortunately, I can tell you that even if you don't think you are a solo ager, somebody you love dies and you become a widow or a widower. So many of us, as we grow older, will go through some period of time as a solo ager. And the 4th is the importance of technology. So let me just say a few words about each of these. Ageism, it's the only acceptable ism in our society. You can still make negative jokes about older people. We all know this from Hallmark cards and things that even make us laugh. Ageism is more than that. It manifests itself in pervasive employment discrimination, in biased healthcare, in media caricatures, and in invisibility. And we know that when ageism is internalized by us, older adults, it leads to poorer mental and physical health. The negative stereotypes we have of ourselves, internalized ageism, is a serious problem. Many of us have said 70 is the new 50. But when you think about it, it's just a way of pretending we're not getting older. The truth is, because of the pandemic, even those of us who denied that we were getting older, well, we can't do it anymore. Because as you all know, now is actually a frightening time to be an older adult. Frightening because people over 60 are particularly vulnerable. The second issue relates to the tensions and opportunities around multi-generational connections. The response to the pandemic reveals that stereotypes about us, boomers, whatever we call us, persist and in some ways have actually worsened. Many of you remember the trending meme at the beginning of the pandemic, #BoomerRemover. A pretty morbid attitude among some that it doesn't matter if older people are the ones who are dying. We heard that a lot. And we also heard that the interests of the younger segments of our population have too often been pitted against the older population as we debate how best to curb the spread of the virus. Okay, Boomer, that meme that basically has young people saying to us, you managed to screw up the world. Look at the world you're giving us. Don't talk to me about any of your wisdom. At the same time, with this tension between generations, this actually turns out to be a new intergenerational moment. The higher vulnerability of us has confronted our adult children, many of them, with their first serious encounter with health challenges that we, parents or grandparents, actually face. And until now, many of us worked really hard to stay and act young, and we didn't want to talk with our adult kids or other adults in our life who we didn't want to share with them our own fears about our health and slowing down. But now we're more able to acknowledge our internalized ageism. We're beginning to admit, actually, that we might need help. and that there are important conversations that we actually should be having with these adult children or the adults in our life who are going to be there for us as we grow older. I mean, I would not have really gotten through the pandemic as well as I did if my stepdaughter didn't shop for me for the first 2 or 3 months when I was afraid to go into a store. And at the same time, many adult children have moved back to their parents' homes, sometimes bringing grandchildren with them. The value and possibilities of intergenerational connections have never been more clear. As Jews, we often think about intergenerational connections as lador vador, from generation to generation. But now I think we're learning that it's actually dor vador, generations with generations. How can we capitalize on that new reality to imagine different kinds of multi-generational possibilities after the pandemic is over? The third issue that really came to public consciousness is the increased focusness on loneliness and isolation in our age cohort, which has only been made worse by sheltering at home. Loneliness and social isolation excuse me, can be as damaging to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And the problem turns out to be particularly acute among us. Studies show that chronic loneliness has clear links to an array of health problems: dementia, depression, anxiety, self-harm, heart conditions, and substance abuse. And we all know that people without social support have a lower chance of full recovery after serious illness than people with a strong network. There are all kinds of studies, data that I can give you, but the bottom line is researchers have begun to find signals in the brain that put the need for social interaction on a par with the need to eat. So this is not just something that is kind of fun or comforting. It's actually something that we need in order to function. Turns out before there was a pandemic, when Margaret Thatcher was still powerful person in the United Kingdom, she appointed a minister of loneliness, essentially a cabinet position for some, people to think through how to mitigate the challenges of loneliness, what kind of social policy needs to be set in place in order to deal with that reality. How important that appears to us now. It was a pandemic before, it was an epidemic, a crisis, a public health crisis, and now people can talk about it. It would have been embarrassing for me to admit that I was lonely, but now I can tell the truth about my experience, and therefore we can begin to deal with it. And fourth and finally is the importance of technology. Lots of us are new to the technology that's become so life-sustaining during this crisis. It's put technology at the center of our consciousness. But also it reminds us that it's a double-edged sword. Digital tools have clear benefits, but there are also trade-offs. I don't know about you, but I'm impressed that there you are in an evening again on a Zoom call, right? There's a loneliness paradox connected to tech and social media that actually makes some people feel more lonely. And then there's Zoom fatigue. There are Zoom life cycle events, thank God for them. But at the same time, what's going to happen when this pandemic is over and we go never back to the way things were before, but to some kind of hybrid world? How are we going to manage technology and our need for face-to-face connection? Let me just say a few more things. I've learned a lot through conversations when I speak about the book. And here are a couple of things that I've learned. First is the real importance of friendship. It turns out that in 1993, Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Fountain of Age. She was one of the first people to kind of name the stage and to write about it. She wrote, more and more, psychologists have found that for older persons, Loneliness is not necessarily linked to the death of a spouse or to how infrequently they see their children or grandchildren, but to the absence of personal relationships with peers, friends of their own age or any age, who share their interests and with whom they sustain their roots of shared experience. So that is really important, and I think it's particularly important for us Jews, because if we acknowledge the significance of friendship, we need to ask ourselves how we can expand our tradition's view of who qualifies as a mourner from the traditional notion that a mourner is a parent, a child, a sibling, or a spouse. The truth is that good friends are mourners too. And how do we create a way to acknowledge that can be comforting to mourners and can acknowledge the power of friendship? Finally, I have learned, I always knew that this was true, but that Jewish tradition really does have wisdom as we negotiate this stage of life. When you think about it, our tradition teaches us that we're supposed to say 100 blessings a day. What does that mean? It means 100 times a day we're supposed to stop and say, wow, wow, I'm eating this apple, wow, where did it grow? Who picked it? How did it get to my hand? Whose labor is responsible for my pleasure at this moment? Blessings are a way of paying attention. And another way of paying attention is to notice the transitions in our life and to mark them. If you look at Jewish life cycle ceremonies, there's a lot clustered at the beginning of our life. A baby is born, there's a baby naming or a brit milah, there's a bar or bat mitzvah, there's a confirmation, there's a wedding. What is the ritual, the life cycle ritual that comes after a wedding? For some of us, divorce, maybe remarriage. But the next life cycle ritual is a funeral. And when you think about that, that's incredibly ironic because I, God willing, am going to live a lot longer between my first marriage and my funeral than between when I was born and I first was married. What are the moments in our life now that deserve ritual, that acknowledge the paying attention to the transitions that we're experiencing? And how do you create them? If you were to ask some other people why there are no life cycle rituals connected to this stage of life, the answer would be, well, we don't need them because we're reliving them with our children and grandchildren. The problem with that is we don't all have children and grandchildren. And the truth is that as much as I love my kids and my grandkids, my life is bigger than just being a mom and being a grandmother. So what are those moments in my life that deserve to be noticed? So let me just read you, and with this I'll conclude, a very short piece from the book that just gives you an example. Notice this is not Jewish, but it was written by a congregant at Temple Emmanuel. Saying goodbye to the house where you raised your children isn't easy, but it's easier if you actually say goodbye. Our daughter, her boyfriend, my husband, and I walk through the rooms of our home, stopping in each one to share good memories and to honor the room for its service. After our journey through time, space, and love, we shed a few tears, toasted the house, and sent it on its way to shelter and protect a new family. Before this ritual, we were stuck, painfully holding on to the house we had built 27 years before when our daughter was born. But after the ritual, we felt joy and contentment as we realized how rich those years had been and how ready we were to let go and move on. An unforeseen benefit is that our daughter's boyfriend now feels more connected to the life and history of our family and says he can't wait to be part of the new memories we make together in our condo. We can't wait either. So what are those moments? Stopping full-time work, children leaving home, becoming a grandparent. What are those moments? And how do you take those moments and create a way of paying attention that feels authentic, that feels Jewish, if that's important, and that helps create a community that can sustain us as we grow older? So I think I'll stop here and see what kinds of questions people have.
All right, thank you. And I want to just say, if anybody wants to pose a question, use the Q&A instead of the chat, just so I can look for them there, and I'll share them with Rabbi Geller. While we wait for questions to come in, actually, let me see, there are a couple. Someone made a note, by the way. Arlene said, talking earlier, you spoke about different names that we're comfortable with as we get older. She said, being a quote unquote senior denotes due respect from youngsters. And then another question that Linda asked was, I think it was in reference to the two books, the Jewish catalog, which by the way was the staple in my home for any Jewish experiences. And I remember it as a child, and then inheriting it from my parents at some point, it became mine. And this woman, Linda's asking, do you recommend one book over the other? Well, one was written by your husband, one was written by you and your husband. It sounds like they're two very good books to own. And based on your talk tonight, they clearly are.
Thank you. I mean, they're very different. The Jewish catalog, again, was written for a generation of young people at a time when, issues of authority were being challenged, and it really challenged the Judaism of the 50s and 60s that many of us grew up in, which was not particularly open to change. And the Jewish catalog really pushed that.
Rabbi Geller, one of the things you said early on that I loved was this I can't remember who it was that you quoted, that loved the name perennials. Well, I spent a lot of time in my garden. I love that idea. Any more thoughts on that being used more often? Is that in common usage, or is that really just one person's note?
The truth is we're inventing this. So what you decide to do at your synagogue in terms of naming whatever it is, that's how things change, right? That's what we learned in the women's movement. I mean, the answers don't exist until we create them. And the reason that these kinds of conversations are important is there's a huge cohort of us. I mean, many congregations, I'm not sure about yours, but many Reform and conservative synagogues, in Orthodox it's different, but a quarter of the congregation is this age cohort, a third of the congregation. How much of the resources of the congregation are going to this age cohort? Nowhere near that amount. How we encourage our community to take us seriously, and how we make clear all that we have to give to the community. Think about this cohort of people, the people on this call. I can't see your faces, but some of you were lawyers, and some of you were doctors, and some of you were teachers, and some of you wrote books, and do you even know who is in the congregation in terms of what they have done? I didn't know that at Temple Emmanuel. How do we become visible? We need to tell our stories, and we need to know the rich resources that exist in our congregation, who, by the way, could be teaching classes and working with young people. I mean, the possibilities are really endless, but it begins with us taking ourselves seriously and the community taking us seriously.
When you did your listening campaign to write the book, or prior to writing the book, I can only imagine that must have been an important and amazing experience. Did any part of it take you by surprise, or was it what you expected? Were you just seeing patterns of answers?
Well, again, what really surprised me was how few people had talked to their adult children about end-of-life issues. I found that really shocking. And I think what also struck me is how important it is to prepare. We prepare for everything in our life, but we don't prepare for this stage. I think that's starting to change. But, like that article that was in the Times, I mean, when we were young, at the Reform rabbis' pension planning, it was about financial issues. It wasn't about, well, what am I going to do when I'm no longer a full-time rabbi? Those of us who have worked and retired, how did you think about your retirement, what you were going to do? How much planning went into it? I mean, and the book sort of raises some of those questions. Some people don't plan. I mean, one of the things that we recommend is that you take a gap year where you check stuff out before you make commitments. But, what will bring purpose? What will bring joy? What will bring community? we discovered that people really want community and friends.
I think about these transitional moments as these kind of gateway mezuzah moments where we say, okay, these just aren't, they're not just gateways to be ignored. We need to affix something in these moments, create ritual, create holiness. One of the things that I see in the community is that I think sometimes people land in retirement rather than travel into retirement. It's as if they're thrown into it. And I think that's what you're saying as well. And I wonder is when you and I spoke privately a few days ago about these shifts from careers into the next phase of life, I'm assuming that most people have that, which is one day I shook hands and said, this is what I do. In other words, this is who I am. And the next day I can no longer say that. I'm just an individual. How do you recommend in the book or now, how do you recommend people make that a more manageable, comfortable, dignified transition from I am A to I am me?
I think that you need to plan for it. And ideally, you need to talk to other people. I mean, many of us in this age cohort are going through a lot of the same things. And the idea of, for example, a wise aging group in the congregation is a wonderful book that Rabbi Rachel Cowan and Linda Thal wrote called Wise Aging. And there are groups, I don't know if there is in your show, but there are groups around the country of people who get together and essentially are in a book club talking about these kinds of issues. We're not, these are not unique to any one of us, and we can learn a lot from each other. One of the issues that comes up a lot is downsizing. Um, Really, what are you going to do with the stuff that your kids don't want? Well, it turns out that many of us have stuff that our kids don't want. Well, what are we doing? Let's talk to each other about it. And what is it that makes it so hard? I grew up in Boston and I had a grandmother who I loved. And when I moved out here, I took her hutch, huge, antique, beautiful piece of furniture, schlepped it across the country. It's been here in my house for more than 40 years, and neither of my kids are going to want it. What am I going to do with it? I'm not going to put it out on the street and wait for somebody to pick it up. And as I really thought about it, I realized that it isn't the hutch that I want my kids to have. It's my grandmother and the stories about my grandmother. So how do I use this moment of deciding what to do with this beautiful piece of furniture where I am really able, first of all, to get in touch with what I really want, and then to find a way to take a photograph of it, tell the story about it, do some kind of ritual with my kids around why my grandmother was important. I mean, who knows what, but I'm not the only person thinking about this. How helpful would it be if in your shul you got a bunch of people together and they shared stories of how they did that? And
Yeah.
how meaningful it would be to hear about each other's grandmothers or grandfathers or ethical wills, or what it means to think about the values that we want to leave behind and in what kind of way.
There was some interesting work done looking at, you may have read this, young people and how much more resilient the group of people were if they knew their family story, if they knew more than their own generation's story, how that contributed to resilience. And I think about that, and I think in my community, a lot of the conversations we have, and we have had a wise aging group that ran for a few years. And now a lot of those people transitioned into other studies. So they're still engaged in conversation groups. But one of the things I think that grandparents feel, if I'm correct, is I don't want to impose my story on my kids. They're too busy. I don't want to impose my religious beliefs and values on my kids and grandkids. They're in a different kind of generation, in a different kind of, let's say, interfaith families. So I think sometimes these grandparents step back because they don't have a comfortable way of stepping forward. Any
Well,
thoughts on that?
yes, I think that the notion of imposing is a bad idea. The notion of sharing and recognizing that it goes both ways. So, one of the things I didn't talk about is that out of our listening campaign, we have a partnership with another synagogue that is near us, and we have created a village, Chai Village LA, which people are members of the synagogues and have created this much more intense community where people do a lot of social stuff together, and they also provide services for each other. services, not religious services, but, take me to the doctor or take out my barrels when I'm whatever. It's been amazing. You can go to our website, chaivillagela.org, and take a look at it. And recently we've been exploring multi-generational connections. And it's not grandparents and grandkids. It's the idea of olders and youngers doing different stuff together and learning from each other. And I think that if that's what it's about, nobody's imposing anything. So it isn't about me and my grandchildren. It's about me, a person that has certain life experience, and a 17-year-old who's in our confirmation program in a class together. We're all students in this class. This is part of one of the projects that we're doing. And it's been quite amazing for the olders to learn what it's like to be a teenager now. I mean, it's a whole different universe. And for the youngers to learn what it was like when we were teenagers. And it's just been very rich and wonderful. So it's not about imposing, and it's not really about grandparents and grandchildren. It's much bigger than that. What are the ways that, given a synagogue, which is a multi-generational institution, there aren't many left, how can you use that richness to really enrich everybody's life? I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, we've started a program this year that's pairing seniors with bar mitzvah age kids, and it's been incredibly enriching. We're in the first few months of it.
And I bet it's enriching for both sides.
Absolutely. I talk to both independently and hear their stories. It's been amazing. I want to just share a couple questions that have come in, comments and questions. So Susie, you say, I like Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi's concept of aging to saging. Rabbi Geller, have you done any work in that arena? And she says, I've just started reading about it.
So you'll notice when you're by Getting Good at Getting Older that one of the chapters in Getting Good at Gaining Wisdom is a chapter from Zalman's book, from Reb Zalman's book. It's called Exercises for Sages in Training. And we got permission from his estate. Reb Zalman was one of Richie's very important teachers. And so, yeah, if Reb Zalman wrote the book about, 15, 20 years ago, before people were thinking about this, like everything else he did it too early. But yes, he definitely is, the wind under the sails of not only a book like this, but also of much of contemporary Jewish life.
I had a conversation with the head of an elder care program here in LA, called One Generation. You might know about them. They do a lot of services for the community. And the woman there, the director, said to me, we're entering into what's known as the silver tsunami. I don't know if you've heard this term, you probably have. The largest number of seniors, perennials, aging people on the planet at the same time in recorded history. So I think this is going to be an important book.
But notice the negativity of seeing it as a tsunami. If you can see it as an incredible opportunity, the Biden administration is talking about national service. What would it be like if national service were really multi-generational? So it isn't just for young people, but there could be, that we who still want to be volunteers or whatever it is, but it wouldn't just be that we would be doing good work in the world, but that we would be doing it in a multi-generational way. It's not a tsunami then. Then it is an opportunity for incredible gifts that are free because I'm not getting paid for the volunteer work I do. I mean, think about it in that way. So the notion of it being a tsunami, I think, is part of the problem. Right. We need to frame this in a positive way and understand it doesn't mean it's easy, but we need to think about it collectively and in a positive way.
There's a woman with us tonight, and I saw her make a comment before, Carol and her late husband, Izzy. In their later years, they became volunteers in Israel, put on uniforms, went back there, and presumably that was a multi-generational experience that we just don't see that much in our society.
So in the book, there is a section on getting good at giving back, and there are resources, and that Volunteers for Israel is one of the resources. Really, so when you're at this moment and you're trying to think, how do I find a volunteer? How do I do that? Read the chapter in the book and then check out the resources.
I want to ask you, because it's 8:02 and I want to be aware of your time and everybody else's. I want to share somebody else's question. A number of comments are coming in, one from Joan who says, I like perennials, also generationals. That's nice as well. And Arlene says, I've discovered I've become fearful of going some places I've never been before, such as an airport or even a new doctor. Why is that? I used to be such an independent woman. I think she probably speaks for a lot of people.
So, there are changes that happen as we grow older, and things that used to be easy become more complicated. And I think, first of all, it's wonderful that Arlene is willing to say that publicly. So once you can say it publicly, then you can begin to deal with it, including acknowledging that you're fearful, and therefore, what are you going to do to be less fearful? Can you take a friend with you? Can you do stuff that's challenging by building in the support that you might need? It's about admitting that we need help. And that is such a difficult thing. When we started Chai Village LA, we realized that everybody in this virtual village, this community, we're still living in our own homes, everybody was very willing to offer help. But it took a lot for somebody to say they needed help. We need to admit that we need help. And then we need to figure out strategies for how to respond. So it's not atypical for what Arlene is talking about. There are other people on this call who feel the same way. Maybe have a conversation, and if you knew that other people were feeling the same way, then you would feel different. I used to be an independent woman. One of the real important things that I've learned in writing the book, and remember that fourth fear, God forbid I should ever be dependent. It turns out that we were never completely independent. Throughout our life, we were dependent and independent and dependent and independent. The real trick of getting good at getting older is learning to be interdependent. How can we offer help and ask for help? How can we create a community that is there to support us so that interdependence becomes something that makes it possible for us to overcome our fears and take risks? That's the challenge. And again, the resources that we have are our own experience and the community of other people that are going through exactly the same thing. So other people on this call, the kinds of work that you do in the synagogue to bring people together to have these conversations, that is what is going to change what it means to get older.
Well, I have one last question. This is one I was thinking about asking you when you began, and I think about the end of Moses' life, and it describes his eyes as being undimmed. And I wonder what you think that archetype is, what that stands for, what that could mean in our lives.
It doesn't mean that we don't have cataracts. It means that we have vision that comes from life experience. So Abraham Joshua Heschel, the very famous Jewish theologian of the last century, said about getting older, just because you're older doesn't mean you're wise. But wisdom has something to do with growing older, with reflecting on our life experience, with believing that we're going to get through this pandemic because we've been through bad times before. You spoke about resilience before. The truth is that people in this age cohort tend to be more resilient than younger people. Why? Because we know Gam ze ya'vor, this too shall pass. We know it because we've lived through it. We know that loss is something that is part of our life, and that you experience sadness and loss, but you continue to go forward. All of that is part of getting good at getting older.
Thank you. I'm just reading so many compliments that have come to you and words of gratitude in the chat bar here. Hopefully you'll get to see them, or we'll send them with you.
Okay, but now I have a favor that I want to ask all of you. One of the things that I learned in the response to the book is that this notion of ritual is actually something that some people find interesting. So my next project, I think, is going to be to try to write a book called Getting Good at marking moments or something about that really deals with this issue of what are the life cycle rituals that we would want to begin to create. What gives us the permission to create them? It's the same question that was asked in the early 70s as we began to create ritual for women's experience. The bottom line is then we learned that our experience as Jewish women was Jewish experience. And even though the ancient rabbis didn't pay attention, it doesn't mean it isn't real. And similarly for us, our experience as active older agers is Jewish experience. What are the kinds of rituals that we ought to be creating? What are those moments? And so what I would really love is if people who are curious about this think about a moment in your life when you might have in fact created a ritual, a big birthday, a renewal of vows, a ritual when somebody you loved was wise enough to give up their keys because they no longer were safe for driving, or something that you may have created at the synagogue. Is there an eldering something when people retire, or should there have been, or have there been moments in your life when you wished you could have marked it, but you didn't know how to do it? Like the woman that of the piece that I read from the book. If you are willing to send me an email and say, I'd love to talk to you about it, I promise that I will call you or email you. And what I'd like to imagine is collecting stories from people and including those stories, like the story of this woman and saying goodbye to the rooms in her home. So you're all experts on this because you're living with it, and it would be helpful to me, and I'd love to be in connection with any of you who want to continue the conversation. So this is a serious offer. So please go to the website and send me an email through the website.
Will do. Thank you. So your email address, or I should say your website, is Rabbi Laura Geller, GELLER.com. The book is Getting Good at Getting Older. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much. This has been really enlightening.
And now for my very last word, 70 is not the new 50. 70 is the new 70. How we do this really matters, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that are watching us. Thank you so much for inviting me into your community.
Really, our gift, our pleasure. Thank you so much for giving us this gift of this conversation. All right, Wendy, I am going to spotlight you. Our spotlight system hasn't worked that well tonight, but everybody hopefully sees you. And if you would say the last word and just let people know what we're going to do next. Thank you. Rabbi Geller, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Geller, for your insightful and enlightening talk. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us tonight and your special words of wisdom. It was an honor and a privilege to have you speak to us and teach us. We all appreciate the meaningful talk you gave tonight. I'd like to invite everyone to join us at our next Rabbi in Residence program on the third Thursday of the month for our future lectures throughout the year. Next month, we're having Rabbi David Woznicka from Stephen Wise Temple speak to us on the first 4 questions God will ask you. Then on May 20th, we have Rabbi Sharon Brous from ECAR coming to speak to us, and we would love to have you join us. You can find us on our website at vosla.org, and please contact me if you would like to sponsor a rabbi. We look forward to seeing you next month on April 15th, so please mark your calendars. Don't forget, if you are interested in purchasing Rabbi Geller's book, Getting Good at Getting Older, you can go to her website, or it is on Amazon. Thank you all so much for coming tonight, and be well.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Rabbi Geller. Thank you to all of you, and Chag Pesach Sameach. I wish all of you a beautiful Passover.